All right, everybody. It is Thursday, January 7th, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and thank you so much for joining me. If you want to get right into the meat and potatoes, if you're watching this on YouTube, check out the links, I believe there. They might be over there. Me and editor Jake have not figured that out yet, but it's on one of these sides. You'll see the links, obviously. You can click on them and jump right into those topics. If you're listening on audio, whether that's Anchor FM, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you, I really appreciate it as always. And we've got a lot of things to cover in the new year. It's been a very busy first week of 2021 for the business of MMA. We've got the Ali Act looking to expand into MMA and really having a decent chance of doing so. I'll break that down based on what's happened in U.S. politics recently. We're going to talk about the unsealing of the documents in the UFC antitrust lawsuit hearings that occurred in 2019. Judge Boulware has decided he's going to unseal all of the evidence that was looked at during those hearings. That's a massive deal for many reasons. I'm going to tell you what documents are going to be unsealed, when we can expect to see them, what information we might find, how that affects the business, everything, the meat and potatoes of a really big deal in terms of what we're going to see as the public and media. And then we're also going to hit some other topics, including the PFL making the rounds on Bloomberg, the middleweight division in the UFC and their gambit to kind of promote it and use that as a vehicle to promote Israel Adesanya. Something that Dana White talked about in terms of following, social media and views of different fighters and how that essentially adds up in their equations for who they decide to push or not, and much more. So let's go ahead and dive right into it with, the Ali Act expansion. So what is the Ali Act? Well, it's a piece of legislation introduced in May of 2000 that sets up protections for fighters from predatory practices that promoters or a particular promotion may use. That includes things like limiting fighter contract lengths, having an independent rankings body. And we're not talking about the UFC style of rankings where you have independent media members who are on that panel and vote, so on and so forth. We're talking about an actual separate body that has no, real affiliation with a promotion to rank fighters. We're also talking about similar bodies that are set up to design titles. So in boxing, right, you will see there are a million different titles. If you don't follow boxing, you can look up Anthony Joshua, where basically he has really become famous in his bout to unify all of these different titles across boxing. It's also something that fans of boxing really complain about, and fans of MMA are worried about if the Ali Act does expand into MMA, and we will get to that in a bit. But it sets up these rules that really, in essence, give fighters a much better chance in terms of negotiating and leveraging for things like decent pay or different types of incentives that they otherwise would have no leverage to gain with a giant promotion like the UFC. This is something that's been talked about forever. It's part of the UFC antitrust lawsuit, which we'll get to later in the show, where, fighters don't have a lot of bargaining power. They really don't. They come in, they are offered a set amount. If you're off of the Contender Series, for example, you might be offered $10K to show, $10K to win. You don't have a lot of wiggle room to negotiate there. You're talking about a $4 billion, at this point, probably closer to 6 or 7 if you would look at some of the valuations, $1 billion entity that has, this giant brand name, all of this power. It's literally synonymous with the casual basis. That's what the sport is, right? I train UFC, or are you a UFC fighter? Think about how many times, if you're more of a hardcore fan, that you've heard somebody say that, or if you're casual and you've stumbled across this, is it possible that you've said that, or people that say that? I do. And that's the type of power you're up against, a giant conglomerate. If you are coming off of a regional promotion, just trying to get by, just getting enough money where you want to, be a star in the sport, or you want to make this as your career, and you get a call from the UFC like, hey, we want you to fight, you don't have a lot of bargaining power to go in there and say, you know what, I think I actually deserve a little bit more money here right off the bat. And even if it's not right off the bat, even if you fought out your first contract and you renegotiate, almost all of the power lies in the hands of the UFC. It's part of how they became as big as they are as a company and how they were able to do the things that they do for the sport. It's a double-edged sword in that way. They've really been able to push the sport and market it and take a huge amount of, resources and throw them at gaining market share and building awareness and really building a fan base globally for the sport, but it comes at the cost of being a giant corporation, which again, go into McDonald's and say, I don't have any experience. Or let's say you do. Let's say you're a manager and you go to McDonald's and you say, hey, you know what? You offered me 30 grand here, and that's what they say is the standard. But I think I'm the best manager you've got, and I think I'm something special, and I'm going to need you to bump that up to 35, 40. They will, even if you have credentials that set you apart from everyone else, where yes, you are the most qualified. Yes, you are the best, so-and-so, whatever position. They will say, no, this is the cap we're going to give you. And they can afford to do that because they have so much bargaining power. So that's kind of what you're looking at here with the Ali Act and fighters. It's a way to instead kind of balance the scale, so to speak, for fighters being able to say, you know what, I'm only going to fight, 3 fights with you, and then we'll renegotiate for the next 3, even if I'm champion, which is massive. Because right now in the UFC, once you get to a certain rank, and especially if you're a champion, you essentially get locked into this never-ending clause of, oh, you defended your belt, great. You now have 4 fights from this, defense of your belt that you have to fight with us. You can't renegotiate. You can't go somewhere else. You can't take your fame and notoriety. And if Bellator offers you double of what we're paying you, you can't go out to another promotion. And it's not just the UFC doing that either. It's most MMA promotions have a championship clause that says if you are holding the belt, you can't just walk away, right? If you watch pro wrestling, you can't take the belt and go over to WCW if you were watching WWE. And maybe that's my age showing and my old pro wrestling roots, but you get the picture. If you have the belt, you are not allowed to go anywhere else as long as you hold that belt. If you decide to retire, that's great. You can't go fight somewhere else. If you get injured, if you get hurt, your contract freezes until you are ready and healthy to come back. And then the time keeps ticking. All of these things are designed to keep the best fighters on a particular promotion's roster locked in to not being able to go somewhere else. It's how the UFC was able to build the brand that they did. It's what the fighters are suing for in the UFC antitrust lawsuit. The Ali Act would eliminate that stuff, which is massive. Now, why am I bringing this up today? Great question. Well, here's the thing. This was brought to Congress by Representative Markwayne Mullin from Oklahoma a while ago. He's a former fighter. He grilled Mark Ratner. You probably heard something about it if you've been following the sport for the past 5 or 6 years. And you may have heard, something again back in 2018 where he had a lot of bipartisan support for this. That means he had both Democrats and Republicans on board to get this passed. And essentially when Trump got into office, he kind of put the kibosh on it. The Trump administration said, you know what, we're not going to do this. We're going to go ahead and quell this. And it made it pretty clear that it was going to be dead as long as the Trump administration was there and as long as Republicans held control, at least of some part of Congress. Well, yesterday, we got the news that, and it looks like it's not officially called yet, but it very much looks like I apologize. It is officially called by several news sites. It hasn't been certified yet, but it looks like it's going to, uphold and not go to a recount here, where we had special runoff elections in the Senate. In November, it certainly looked like while the Democrats would control the House, Republicans would maintain control of the Senate, effectively choosing what bills could come to the Senate floor to be voted on, ratified, all of that. And it was at this point where really you thought that if you were part of the MMA Fighters Association or you were someone trying to push for this bill, you saw the Republican controlled Senate, how they feel about labor laws, where they're really anti-union. They're much more about free market, all of that. they're not going to let the Ali Act come to the floor, let alone get enough votes to vote for it, because the party would essentially say, no, we're lining up behind this. It looks like, as far as I can tell, and as far as, checking with my father, who is a political scientist, got his degree from Harvard, so I think he knows this stuff. As far as I can tell here, it looks like the Democrats are going to end up winning 50 seats. Now, there's 100 seats in the Senate, so 50 would still go to Republicans, but the tiebreaker goes to the vice president, which in this case would be Kamala Harris, and essentially gives Democrats control of the Senate. They also won control and held control, really, of the House in November, this past November, November 3rd. So now you've got a trifecta of the Democrats controlling each part of Congress, right? You've got the House, the Senate, and the presidency all lined up together. And this isn't something that's going to go to the Supreme Court and get struck down or anything like that. It's not similar to a lawsuit or a real groundbreaking thing where the Supreme Court's probably going to hear this. I guess hypothetically they could, but I would bet a lot of money that's not the case. Instead, what's going to happen is that bipartisan support that was there before is most likely going to show its head again. Now that there's been a swift change administration, things are changing, obviously, on Capitol Hill. We won't dive into everything that happened very recently, but clearly there's been a shift in tone in terms of what's happening in the U.S. and in politics. It also is important because the Senate decides and really approves the cabinet members that the incoming president selects. And that's big because if the Republicans controlled the Senate when Biden took office, it's very likely that a lot of his picks would have been kind of moderate and would have been able to get through a Republican-controlled Senate for approval, right? So Janet Yellen is a great example of that, where, if Republicans had held control of the Senate, probably would have been passed through no problem because she's moderate enough. They like her enough. You're not going to have a lot of people up in arms and Republicans saying, oh, that's not allowed. Now the Democrats basically get to decide themselves who they want to put in the cabinet, and the Republicans can't do anything to stop them. So you could be looking at someone like Andrew Yang. And Andrew Yang has been very vocal recently about his thoughts on pro-unionization for pro wrestlers, for fighters, everything of that sort. I mean, he's a good friend of Leslie Smith's. She's spoken at several of his rallies when he was running for president. He's been on the Luke Thomas show. He's been on a lot of different outlets openly speaking that he feels that the Ali Act needs to come to MMA. If he gets any sort of cabinet position, I would not be shocked at all for him to push for that and kind of signal the way for that bipartisan group to go ahead and push this HR 44 to the floor and vote on it. And if they vote on it and they pass it, it's done. It's a done deal. The Democrats are all for this type of thing. They are more than likely going to pass this if it comes to the floor. The real question is, will it be brought to the floor given the priorities that the Democrats have politically? And we're not going to go into that because that's a whole other thing that I am not qualified to speak on. But the reason I've gone down this, political path as much as I have is because there is a very good shot that the Ali Act will get expanded into MMA. And if and when that happens, the ramifications are both instant and mind-blowing. This is something that can probably do much more for the sport than the UFC antitrust lawsuit. And I say that because the antitrust lawsuit, seeks damages for, fighters not being paid enough between 2010 and 2016 or 2017, and looks to prove that the UFC had an illegal monopoly power and they owe fighters money. If you got all the way to a settlement or a judgment, right? Let's say this went to trial and the UFC lost. And we're talking about all the appeal, after all the appeals, all of that. Let's say it's done. They have lost. It's over. If that happens, what the actual, judgment will be what the ramifications of what comes down as judgment will be is up to the judge still. It's still or jury. And that could be anything from, yes, you've got to limit your fighter contracts, you've got to make these changes to your big business practices going forward, so on and so forth, to, all right, yes, there was issues, issues were had during this time period. You owe the fighters this amount of money. And it could be a lot, right? That's the real big key for the antitrust lawsuit, is that it could end up being more than the entire company is worth, like billions of dollars. Or it could be that they say, you know what, you're owed a couple, 100 million, which is still a big blow to the UFC, especially right now while they're in so much debt and Endeavor is kind of swimming and fighting for their lives due to COVID-19. But this also would not occur, and any type of judgment would not occur until way down the line. The only thing that could possibly occur probably in the next 5 to 10 years, and really on the other side of 5 years or sooner, would be a settlement, I would imagine, between the UFC and the plaintiffs, if it came to that. And the UFC would really have to be looking at some damning piece of evidence or something that says, oh, we've got to make a deal here. And in that case, they would at least be able to prepare for it, do what you have to do, figure that out. Otherwise, any sort of real groundbreaking changes or huge monetary sum that the UFC would have to end up paying to these fighters wouldn't be decided probably for another decade. I mean, this lawsuit has been going on for 5 years, and we're still not there yet, right? We just got class certification 5 years in. We're not even at trial to really look at the evidence and make the arguments of, yes, they broke the law, or no, they didn't break the law, all of that. We're not there. We are just at, is this a class action lawsuit, or is this something where the fighters individually have to sue, which just recently it's been certified as a class action lawsuit, but that could still be overturned. UFC's already filed motion to appeal. That's going to keep going on. So, I mean, this is massive because the Ali Act could occur right now, instantly. Hypothetically, in February, if they wanted to, Congress could say, all right, cool, we're going to bring the Ali Act up, and probably would have enough votes to pass it through. Biden would almost certainly sign it. I can't imagine a reason he won't. And then it would go into effect immediately. That's huge, because that would undo the UFC, Bellator's, PFL, One Championship, all of their models. Sorry, not One Championship, because they are based in a different country. PFL, UFC, Bellator, all of that. It would really just change the entire MMA landscape, and it could do it not overnight, but seemingly overnight. It would feel like overnight to a lot of fans and people that haven't been paying attention. So it's important for you to be aware of this, because especially, we've been talking a lot about the lawsuit. We've been talking about a lot of other things. This is really flown under the radar because it looked like it wasn't going to be a possibility, and it wouldn't even be up for discussion again until 2022, when you had the US midterms going on. But now, because the Democrats have won both runoff races, and as long as that stands, this could well happen within the next 2 years. Again, it will depend on priorities. Obviously, the Biden administration has a lot they want to get done. If it falls to the wayside and it isn't pushed, and then 2022 comes along, historically, incumbent presidents have fought and usually lost seats from their political party in the U.S. in either the Senate or the House. So there's no guarantee that 2022 and beyond, at this point, they would have the right votes and the right makeup in either the House or the Senate to pass this bill. But right now, they have a clear shot to do it. So if that priority is there, it's a done deal. And there's a good shot that it's going to happen. So stay tuned, because that is, again, the ramifications here are mind-blowing. I mean, I want you to, I think this is the best way to cap this off. Imagine if Conor McGregor ends up winning the lightweight championship, right? Let's say Khabib's retired. Conor McGregor beats Dustin Poirier, fights somebody else for the lightweight championship, or they make Poirier versus McGregor for the championship. It's a little late for that, but you get the point. He's the lightweight champion. And this Ali Act has been passed. They've negotiated 3 fights on his deal. He fights those 3 fights, he's champion. And what if he says, you know what? Nah, I'm going to go ahead and go to Bellator. Yeah, I'm the lightweight champion, but you know what? Bellator is offering money. I'm going to go ahead and go there. Could you imagine what that could do? I mean, look at it in boxing. This is what we see in boxing, right? We see, Canelo's sign with different people. He signed with DAZN, and now that's a whole big deal, and it looks like he's out of his contract, but he signed with Golden Boy. He signs with different people. He doesn't just stay in one spot. That's not possible right now in MMA. That's what we're talking about. And yes, I understand the fan concern with, then the best are going to all duck each other. There's going to be like 7 or 8 belts. It's a possibility. I won't sit here and say it's not, but the one thing I take solace in that regard is that right now, the way MMA is set up, I feel like if that were to happen, where you've got now all these different governing bodies and there's multiple titles everywhere, I feel that luckily the way MMA is set up at the moment, it wouldn't be an immediate shift as well, right? It would take a while for it to devolve into that, where you've got, this rhetoric now that's just constant in boxing of the best don't really fight the best. They fight a bunch of other, people in mandatory matchups and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And that causes a lot of issues because of the independent rankings and the way that these governing bodies and that give out the titles, rank fighters and all of this. But, boxing still has really great fights, and MMA would still have really great fights. And more than that, the optimist in me says that, if the Ali Act is passed, that opens up the door for finally having fights like Douglas Lima versus Kamaru Usman, or Patricio Pitbull versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, or Conor McGregor, or Israel Adesanya taking on Gegard Mousasi, right? That opens the door for these matchups. So I'm hopeful for that, but I understand, especially if you are a boxing fan, if you've seen the boxing model, I understand your concern there too. There's no telling what will actually happen, but again, expect some news on this, and expect, especially if Andrew Yang gets a cabinet position, expect this to probably get passed in the next 2 years. All right, next up, another huge piece of news that I want to cover on this episode is the fact that we're looking at Judge Boulware unsealing the documents from the UFC antitrust lawsuit hearings that occurred in 2019. This is very big in a lot of ways. These documents are things like Brock Lesnar's contract. And we're talking about literally his contract, his specialty contract of all the different things in his special agreement with the UFC when he came to the UFC. We're talking about financials of not just the UFC from 2010 to 2016, but competitors such as Bellator, Strikeforce, all of those guys. Pride. We're looking at actual real financials there, not just percentages that we've seen before, looking at real financial information. We're talking about different tactics used and that really opened the books on how the UFC conducted business between 2010 and 2016. You will have a little bit of Bellator in there. You'll definitely have Strikeforce because the UFC acquired it, but it's really the focus, of course, will be on the UFC because this is a lawsuit brought against the UFC. But it will show how really kind of the secret sauce is what we're potentially looking at here of how the UFC became a $4 billion valued company in 2016. How it went from its origins to getting to that point. This is going to open up and show so many things that, I mean, there's no telling what we could really find in here. We're going to know a lot more about fighter pay. We're going to know a lot more about the exact amount of money the UFC made during this time period, which is massive because you've got a lot of people still saying, oh yeah, we gave them a fair share. Yes, we did. Similar to soccer revenues, I believe one of the Fertitta brothers said when asked about this a long time ago, we've already kind of seen that that's not entirely true based on the information we have. We've had people like John Nash, go on Twitter and guess what the numbers are, and then suddenly the files that were not redacted become redacted because of that, because he's kind of spot on with some of this stuff. We've seen this stuff to a small degree, but now we are talking about huge amounts of information about the UFC's business practices, from 2010 to 2016. And that information is going to be invaluable for us as fans, as us as media, but also for the competitors of the UFC to see really how they managed to accomplish what they did, and, maybe kind of borrow some of the tactics if they're applicable, or see, oh, that's how they did it. We always wondered how you did X, Y, and Z. Now we have that missing piece of the puzzle. We can now take that and put it into our business model and try and replicate it. It's, you don't see Apple going over to Google and being like, hey, here's all of our proprietary data. Here's how we got to where we are. You don't. There's a reason why. And again, it's not going to be a total open book on all of the UFC's practices, right? That's anything that's not part of the trial or submitted as evidence in these antitrust hearings. Obviously, we won't know what went down, but it's going to really shine a brand new light and crack things open similarly to how the hearings in 2019 opened up, a treasure trove of information for us in regards to the way that fighters are paid, the revenue share that the UFC has compared to other entities, business tactics, including, the formulaic type of thing when a fighter signs, right, and then has a 3 or 4 fight contract and then gets bumped up to what essentially was in an Excel sheet, just, oh yeah, step 1, step 2, step 3, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. It revealed that some of these guys say, yeah, I'm really good and I do great negotiation with the UFC. It turns out, no, not really. I mean, if you had somebody special under your wing, sure, but otherwise, we saw some emails between managers and Joe Silva where, nothing really came of it. It was, hey, Joe Silva says, this is how much you're going to get. Manager says, hey, we need this, or here's why, X, Y, and Z. My fighter deserves this. And Joe Silva's like, this is what we're paying the other guys. This is what he's got to deal with. And by and large, that's what happened. Is it followed a set formula that was programmed into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. We learned so much from the 2019 hearings, and we still didn't, see even a fraction of what the evidence was brought to Judge Boulware by the plaintiffs, by the UFC, refuting certain things, because so much of it was heavily redacted. So much of it was sealed, so that essentially only parties involved in the lawsuit were privy to the information. This unsealing is massive in what we could find. It's also possible, I need to temper expectations a little bit, as I've just gone through and said, man, this is a massive deal. Holy crap. I've got to temper expectations, though, because it's also possible that we get these records unsealed and unredacted, and we find things that are, oh, okay, here's Brock Lesnar's contract. Now we know that for sure. Oh, yes, now we know this, about the UFC's business practices. But it might, by and large, already be things that we're kind of guessing at right now, right? There's a lot of articles that you can look up. There's some of mine. There's obviously John Nash, Paul Gift, Jason Cruz. There's a lot of people that have covered this. And I mean, those guys obviously are the core. They've been at it since its inception, where they were able to, again, deduce about what the UFC's revenue was, or, figure out that, yeah, they are, holding the top 5, top 10 ranked guys in the world, and they're basically putting them in these extra contracts, extra long contracts, or these locked in contracts, so they can't go to other places, so they can kind of build this brand that has the best in the world. They were able to do all that. And while we don't have official confirmation that all of their information was right, we do have a lot of things that kind of signal that they were very close in their estimates of pay-per-view buys or revenue share split or things of that nature, or in some cases we're right on the money. So it could be that we get this unsealing and unredaction, and it's, oh, here's all this stuff, and we learn a couple of cool tidbits here and there, but nothing groundbreaking, because we've already been able to deduce and reverse engineer some of the documents and information we've had, just by using some math and some other sources like Moody's, who's talked about different loans and what they amounted, the UFC's revenue, estimated revenue was, things of that nature. There are different sources you can kind of pick and gather this information from in order to get pieces and get a good idea of the whole picture. And it's very possible that we really kind of already have that. Now, if I'm a betting man, I'm going to say that's not really the case. I just want to throw that out there so that I don't get people saying, like, you said this was going to be the biggest thing ever, and then it fell flat on its face. I really do think we're going to get a bunch of new information that will, shine some light into the UFC's business practices, really kind of blow off the doors on some of these arguments, stating that the UFC, didn't have the money to pay fighters, that it was equal to, what soccer paid their athletes and that type of revenue share. I think we already have enough information to kind of, put that to rest, but I think it's going to kind of blow the doors off it at this point with things we could learn. And I'm excited to see what we could learn from these documents as well. Now, do keep in mind that the date we have for this is January 11th. And that's the date that the judge has said where if a party is going to, really make a case and say, or do something legally to block the unredaction or the unsealing of these documents, they have to do it by that date. Come January 12th, if nothing has been filed, if nothing has been done to legally stop Judge Boulware from doing that, he's going to unseal and release these documents. And, let me back that up a little bit. Won't necessarily be on January 12th, from my understanding. Really, they have until January 11th to, file anything of that nature. But if January 12th rolls around and nothing's been done to stop that, right? If either party maybe raises a second objection or tries to file an injunction or something of that nature, and it's not granted, and January 12th rolls around and there's nothing stopping from Judge Boulware from doing that, at some point after January 12th and beyond, he will then unseal those records and we will get unredacted information. And not just some of them, all of them used in the UFC antitrust case. That's, again, a treasure trove of info. It will probably be talked about on this show for most of the year. The things we learn from, the things we learn from those documents, I would guess, will be a major part of this show and will be written about and a heavy part of Q1 guaranteed of 2021. But I could see, going all the way into the entirety of the year, simply because you've also got the Ali Act expansion. You've got a new administration in the White House who is very much pro-union, where the last administration was complete opposite. There's going to be a lot of changes that are going to affect the UFC, and it's going to be hard for the UFC to run their business as they have in the past. So stay tuned for that. I am hoping that we will end up getting those documents unsealed and in our hands on January 12th. I'm obviously, on the lookout, on a super high alert for those documents. Once I get them, I will spend all day or all night, whenever I get them in my hands, sifting through them, getting the best parts of them. I will put it in a show immediately. That will either be a special episodes of this, or, as this is planned to happen next week, it's possible that we end up not doing Fight Business Podcast next week and we do the special show once I've got those documents in hand. But either way, I, of course, will be here to give you the biggest bits of information, to break down, the business ramifications for this, what a lot of this information, being leaked is going to do to the UFC, because the ramifications of that, they're either going to have to continue to operate on a open business model, so to speak, so that their competitors know exactly what they're doing, or they're going to have to make some internal changes and pivot, which is going to be hard given the financial situation they're currently in. They're still reeling from COVID. Endeavor is reeling from COVID and needs UFC to make a good profit so they can pay out dividend to their investors. It's a lot of things converging on the UFC at once right now that could spell trouble for the promotion in terms of the way they've done business in the past. That doesn't mean the UFC is going away, doesn't mean that they're done for, anything like that. It just means that it really looks like to me the forces of the market are converging in a way where the UFC is going to have to adjust, and they're going to have to change some crucial parts of their business practice, or just be open about it and, hope that a competitor can't capitalize on it, depending on which way they want to go. But it's not a fun time to be in the UFC corporate C-suite, really, to have to make those decisions, to figure out how they're going to pivot and keep up that growth that they're so desperately trying to keep going at this point. So that's my 2 cents on it, but I will let you know as soon as I have those documents in hand, and I will drop a video immediately when I have enough information to bring that to you guys. All right, with those 2 big topics out of the way, I want to touch on a couple other things here. Dana White did a fan Q&A on Tuesday, January 5th, that I attended, watched just to see what it was. You obviously saw people like Nolan King. I forget the other journalist who was tweeting out about it, but there were obviously some of us were watching there just to see what Dana would say to different matchups and if he'd break any news, things of that nature. But one thing he talked about that I feel like was overlooked by a lot of the media was he went on a little bit of a side tangent where he discussed, how they were tracking Khamzat Chimaev's followers. But they basically said, like, yeah, he was at 36,000 followers and then went to over 1 million after those fights when he made his legendary, three fights in the UFC, got him from 36,000 to 1 million. And he had someone off camera give him those numbers immediately, right? This wasn't, oh, I have to look it up or I have to do everything. This was somebody that knew those numbers like that. That says a lot. That shows you how much the UFC is tracking all of those metrics. He also, Dana White then went on to talk about Chase Hooper, and that 6.7 million views had happened on Chase Hooper's Contender Series fight, and talked about how the system is able to print out reports that shows how many people watched just that fight and just tuned in. This is a rare moment where Dana White has, I don't know if it's unknowingly or if he's just kind of boasting about it, probably a little bit of both, but he's kind of drawn back the curtain on specific things the UFC looks for in terms of pushing and promoting fighters. When you look at someone like Israel Adesanya, who the UFC is extremely high on, and we'll cover here in a little bit, and they're trying to push, and who is a draw and is able to bring in extra pay-per-view buys, and why he's gotten the push he has, a big part of that, I'm sure, is looking at the metrics that they saw from the ESPN view system, social media, all of those different things. And that's really, when you're talking about if somebody's a draw, if they're not, why is X, fighter not being pushed by the UFC? Why? Favorite example, the legendary example, of course, is Demetrius Johnson. You look at what DJ accomplished in the cage, and you have to give him credit as one of, the best mixed martial artists of all time, right? He really put on just dominating performance after performance after performance in flyweight. Had a couple of losses in bantamweight, and then obviously lost to Henry Cejudo in a very close decision. But he, was regarded as the number 1 pound per pound fighter at one point a couple of years ago. And yet he was not headlining pay-per-views. it was kind of open that he wasn't getting pay-per-view points, that he was just getting a flat fee for his services. And everyone kept saying, like, why is the UFC not pushing the flyweight division? Why are they letting flyweights go? I mean, it seems like a lifetime ago now that you've got Davison Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno headlining UFC 256 and putting on the fight they did. It seems like a lifetime ago, but the flyweight division was almost dead. Henry Cejudo saved the flyweight division is the quote that is used in a lot of fan circles and media circles, right? But the question was always why? Why is the UFC not pushing this? Why is the UFC not pushing the women's featherweight division? I have said for a long time on this show, in articles, for as long as I can remember, the UFC makes every decision that they make in terms of booking fighters, pushing fighters, doing different marketing ploys based on metrics. They do not, you cannot become as big as the UFC is without big data-driven decisions, and that's what they've been doing. And Dana basically admitted that in the fan Q&A. If you don't think that he doesn't look at, the views report when you have a Contender Series show and doesn't go through and say, oh, okay, so Shannon Bias, right? Yes, views are higher than the rest. Okay, we want to put her in a particularly good matchup. We want to look at maybe pushing her. Let's see how she does on the undercard of a fight night. Let's see how she does. Let's see how, this fighter is drawing this many views on ESPN system. His social media has climbed about 30%. Okay, let's see how he does on the main card of a pay-per-view under XYZ. Or let's see how he does, headlining a fight card. That's the conversations that are being had within the UFC's walls. Those are the conversations. It's not just, what's a good matchup stylistically, huh? It's not, hey, Sean Shelby, let's take a look at this. Or Mick, let's take a look. Okay, yeah, I really like this fight stylistically. Yeah, let's just put it. Yeah, I like those guys. I've got a good feeling about this. Let's put them. Let's put it on UFC 259, X versus X, because I like those guys. They're nice to me. No. While there is this perception that Dana White has his favorites, and I'm sure there is favoritism there. I'm not going to sit here and say there's not, especially after some of the things we've heard about Joe Silva and the matchmaking that happened during his tenure. I'm sure there are, favorites within the promotion, but there's also data to back it up, right? It's not just favorites and gut instincts and one or two people who are savants saying, yes, I know how to matchmake and I know this is what's going to make sense and get the most pay-per-view buys. And if we build a card like this, we're going to get, 600,000 buys. No. They use big data to help influence and inform all of their decisions. And that's a huge reason for Khamzat versus Leon. People keep asking me, why are they rebooking Khamzat Chimaev versus Leon Edwards again when Chimaev is unranked, only fought at welterweight once, and Leon is number 3 and could arguably be fighting for the belt? Why do they keep doing this again? Because the metrics are there. The metrics for Chimaev are off the chart. And if he is able to beat Edwards, you best guarantee he is going to get an immediate title shot. They've done this before. Cody Garbrandt is a prime example of this, where he really fast-tracked to a title shot against Dominic Cruz. If you go back and you look at the records and where things stood at the time in the bantamweight division, Rafael Assunção or TJ Dillashaw probably deserved a shot at Cruz. Dillashaw did come off of a loss at Cruz, so you could say, okay, well, maybe not an immediate rematch. Sure. Assunção, though, from a merit-based standpoint, Assunção was definitely more deserving. And there were plenty of people in between, too. And Garbrandt, beat Almeida, and whoop, here we go. Right? And Mizugaki, I think those were the two he beat, and then he fought Cruz next. And people are scratching their heads like, what? How did that happen? It happened because of the numbers, because of the metrics. They were there. They were trying to build Cody Garbrandt into the next big star. It didn't work out for them the way they wanted to, but, and I don't think they've necessarily given up on him either, but That's the type of thing that influences these matchmaking decisions where you scratch your head. Dana admitted to it. And I'm sure if you had a fan Q&A where somebody asked him, like, what are the metrics you look at, he'd probably just go ahead and break it down and be like, we check this and this and this. They're more likely to get a fight for this or this. That's the whole entertainment aspect. It's because it's about influencing ratings. It's about influencing views on ESPN's platform in this case. Now that ratings are kind of secondary to ESPN Plus. It's about pay-per-view buys. It's all about trying to find the next Conor McGregor, the next Ronda Rousey, next John Jones. I mean, that's why they're pushing Israel Adesanya, because he's drawing enough numbers. He's had the views. He's had, in MMA media circles, he's been talked about being this big star for a long time. And I really haven't seen a ton of outside information to back that up. At least I didn't. Let me rephrase that. I didn't for the longest time. And I still don't think he's on the level of Jones or definitely not McGregor or Rousey or probably Masvidal at this point in terms of pay-per-view buys and drawing power, but he certainly has potential, and the UFC knows it, and they're getting metrics to back that up. And he is drawing much higher than, say, Amanda Nunes, right? Amanda Nunes is the consensus GOAT women's fighter for many a fan and journalist. And yet, she's not been pushed a ton by the UFC. Why? Because the metrics were never there. Because if you look at before, UFC went behind the ESPN Plus paywall, her pay-per-view buys were not super high. And that's what they're all about. They're about business. So again, I will say this and die on this hill. It's if you watch any type of matchmaking or any type of decision the UFC makes with putting two fighters against each other or pushing a particular division or something like that, and you say, what? It's not about merit. It never has been. It's about business. It's about those numbers in the background that they are crunching constantly. That Dana White can say, how many followers did Chimaev go from before he went here to where he is now? And he has someone, probably an intern, sitting right there who has the exact numbers that's able to give it to him in a split second. And he's able to say, Chase Hooper, 6.7 million buys. And he just knows that because he's been looking at those reports. That's the business, guys, at least for the UFC. I'm assuming Bellator and PFL and ONE all have similar type of metrics and things that they're looking at, or at least are trying to use that type of model. But that's the business, guys. It's how things work. So speaking of Israel Adesanya in the middleweight division, and this ties into the metrics conversation that I just had, Dana White in that fan Q&A also said that he thought that middleweight was a very stacked division. He was essentially asked by a fan, hey, what do you think is the most stacked division right now? He had just talked about lightweight. He said it's hard to argue against lightweight, which is true. Lightweight is a very, very deep division of the UFC. But then he went to middleweight. He said, yeah, middleweight right now is really up and coming and super great. A lot of fans and media were scratching their head at this. I know I was. We have a video, me and Drake Riggs talk about this, where, I would rank the middleweight division in terms of the UFC's depth of divisions. I would rank the middleweight division in the lower half. I think I ranked them at 8 or 9. I mean, you look at bantamweight, you look at flyweight now, you look at featherweight, welterweight, lightweight, all of those divisions are stacked, have contenders for days. I mean, if you're talking about an exciting fight in the UFC right now, it's probably between 125 pounds and 170. And then you've got the women's divisions too, right? Women's strawweight is stacked. Flyweight and bantamweight obviously need some growth. You've got some big names there, but I would put middleweight above those two on the women's side. But, I am kind of, looking at this, and a lot of people were looking at this saying, like, why would he say that? And again, this goes back to pushing Israel Adesanya. Izzy is obviously the closest thing to a star or a new star outside of Jorge Masvidal that we've seen in a long time. right? Since the UFC's heyday, where, let's not forget, back in the day, you had a lot of cards averaging 500,000 buys, 675,000 buys. We're talking back in the days of tap out shirts when it was on every single Buffalo Wild Wings ever. In my small hometown where I grew up, Macomb, Illinois, middle of nowhere, we had a Buffalo Wild Wings get built. I forget what age I was. But it was like a big deal because I was like one of the few like, whoa, restaurants are in town, like a chain restaurant's finally here. And you could not go to Buffalo Wild Wings on a Saturday anytime after 6 or 7 p.m. You had to go at least 5:30 so that you could get a seat before the mad rush of people packing the UFC pay-per-views. And they showed every single UFC pay-per-view. Now, I mean, I think it's been 2 or 3 years, they don't show UFC pay-per-views anymore. If you look at the UFC Bars site, right? There's a site called UFC Bars that essentially says like, hey, these bars have confirmed that they are purchasing, whatever pay-per-view. Outside of McGregor versus Nurmagomedov or, a really big thing like that, it's really dying down. Even here in Austin now, when I first moved here, lots of bars were showing most of the pay-per-views. Yeah, you had some basically fan favorite bars of like, oh yeah, that's where I go to go watch the fights. Over the past several years, that's slowly been declining. A couple of places that I started watching out the fights here when I first moved here don't show them anymore. And it's not worth it. I mean, that just tells you about the overall decline of where we went from, that level of tap out and UFC was the next big thing and all of that in, early 2010s, that era, to where we are now. So they will latch on to anyone they think can sell pay-per-views. And it's clear right now, with Ronda Rousey retired and probably never coming back, you've got Conor McGregor, who's still fighting and still, as he showed on social media and basically revealed the actual pay-per-view numbers through ESPN Plus. He's still a huge draw. You've got John Jones, who's still a big draw, although I would say it is kind of diminished behind the ESPN Plus app and kind of doesn't have the same drawing power that he used to when he did, say, with like a feud with Daniel Cormier, that type of thing. But he's still a big draw. You've got Jorge Masvidal, whose rise to stardom we've watched over the past year or two, in terms of the Askren knockout, the three-piece and a soda, all of that stuff, beating Nate Diaz and taking the shine Diaz had from beating McGregor, and now it's really passed on to Masvidal winning the BMF belt with The Rock giving it to him, all that stuff. And then there's Izzy, who is drawing well. I mean, again, we've talked about this before on the show. It's hard to know about exact numbers. We know Conor's exact numbers. We don't know a lot of other people's exact numbers because the source is essentially data. So it's hard to know how much of it he's inflating and how much of it is true. But we know that, and I think we can safely look at, even if the numbers that are out there for Adesanya's pay-per-views are inflated, they're still higher than what we've heard. Even if you take away the inflation, it's not that somebody's saying Adesanya did 800,000 buys. It's not that he actually did 200,000, right? It's not going to be that much of an exaggeration. Maybe he did 600. Maybe he did 5, but I don't think you go below that mark. And that's a big deal in this day and age. I still don't think he's at the level of, a Masvidal or McGregor. I think that should be pretty clear at this point. I think he is at or a little under the level of Jones, depending on the matchup. We'll have to see how that continues. I think he's going to surpass Jones here shortly. But the point is that the UFC is desperately trying to make him into the next Masvidal, into the next McGregor. I mean, ideally, McGregor is extremely hard to replicate and probably already would have happened by now if it was going to. But they can make him into the next Masvidal, and they can make him into a draw similar to what Jones was back in his prime. And in order to do that, you've got to continue to boost him up. That's why he's going up to the light heavyweight division to fight Jan Blachowicz, make him the champ. Maybe even have him defend both belts and go that route to get more eyes on him. It's why Dana is promoting the middleweight division. Because, yes, Adesanya has beat 5 out of the top 10 guys in the UFC rankings right now. I do think Marvin Vettori and I think Robert Whittaker those fights could go differently. I'm not saying they would, but I think there is still, some fights left for Izzy there. But outside of that, when you start going into 11-15, there's not a lot there for Adesanya, and really the division is kind of shallow, right? I can't think of the last middleweight who wasn't ranked that I was on here talking about. I think it was Kevin Holland, who now is ranked at number 10, rightfully so. But that's even after a win over Jacare, who I love Jacare. If you've watched this show or you've watched other videos I do, you should know I am a big Jacare fan, but he's older and he's been around a long time. So yes, beating him was a big deal for Kevin Holland, but the fact that catapulted him into the top 10 shows that it's not as deep as a division as, say, bantamweight, where it's going to take you multiple wins to get into the top 15, top 10. And if you had an older person like Jacare fighting in a division that stacked, my guess is he would have been out of the rankings a long time ago in that case. Featherweight, another one. You've got so many good guys in there who are on the cusp and that we still talk about that aren't ranked. And it's yes, I want to see some of these guys fight each other. And yes, I want to see them fight ranked opponents to see where they stack up. But we can talk about the division as a whole because there's so much depth there. In middleweight, really after the top 10, yes, you got Edmund Shabazian, who's an up-and-comer, he's younger. But, I mean, then you got Chris Weidman, who has held on, really was unranked, and then got his ranking by beating Omari Akhmedov, who, again, semi-unproven. Ian Heinisch is ranked in there. All, good fighters, but not killers, not up and coming. Oh man, this guy could shake up the division, right? Some of them are young enough. Shabazian for sure. Heinisch could end up, getting his game together to a point where maybe he makes a run at it. But I mean, Weidman, Souza, these guys are their championship reigns or chances of championship reigns are pretty much done. They're at the tail end of their career. They're looking to retire in the next 2 to 3 years, if not sooner, in Jacare's case and maybe even Weidman's case. And that shows you the state of the middleweight division. So if you hear a lot of push for the middleweight division by Dana White, by the UFC, if you see a lot of media outlets that also kind of do a little bit of PR for the UFC, which you should know what they are by now, pushing middleweight as this, row of killers, and you're scratching your head and saying, what? Or you're new and you think, oh, really? Okay, maybe. The reason they're doing it is to push Adesanya. They're galvanizing between the one guy they think can start to bring in consistent pay-per-view buys for them at a level that's, again, similar to Masvidal. Not going to be McGregor, but Jones, right? Be active enough. Izzy has defended the UFC's pay. He hasn't gone on record like Masvidal has saying, hey, I want more money and all of this. Or Jones, Izzy seems to be a company man. And they are galvanizing behind him big time. So that's why you're seeing a huge push right now in terms of the middleweight division getting love from Dana White and why Izzy's moving up, all of that stuff. You're going to continue to see Izzy get pushed hard by the company as long as he wins. If he loses, if he goes up and fights Yan, knocks him out, then we're talking about an entirely different thing. But again, this is why you're seeing this type of conversation and why you're seeing middleweight getting a push from the boss man at the UFC himself. Don't be fooled. It's not that middleweight got super deep. It's not that there are killers that everyone's missing. It's not that you're going crazy looking at that saying, really? It's a stacked division. And do I have this wrong? No. It's all a marketing ploy around Israel Adesanya. Last thing I want to touch on real quickly here is the PFL appearing on Bloomberg television quite a bit lately. So Loren Mack, the director of corporate communications for the PFL, is known for his ability to get marketing and certain interviews with various influential people. He did this at One Championship. He used to be over at One Championship. If you know about One Championship's marketing efforts, I think you already know what they were able to do with some of the claims that they made, some of the interviews they did. If not, you should check it out. Loren is very, very good at his job. I will say that. He is extremely good at his job, and getting the PFL in front of Bloomberg, especially on Bloomberg television, is a big deal. Why? Well, as I mentioned on this show before, PFL is still in that startup stage, right? When you start something like the PFL, where you're paying out $1 million to each tournament winner, it's not that you have enough revenue coming in from those live shows and from your broadcasting deals and all that to be able to pay all of that out, as well as your operations costs and any overheads for event costs. All fighters that don't make the tournament still get, or I'm sorry, don't make the playoffs and eventually win the playoffs, still get paid, right? You got a lot of costs there. They're not profitable right now. And that's to be expected. They are only a couple years old. They obviously, got ravaged by COVID by not having their season. They're looking to jump back in April. So in about 3 months or so, they've made some big signings in the meantime with Anthony Pettis and some other guys. The reason they're able to do that is because they've got investment flowing in from big people. As I mentioned before, you had Washington Wizards owner, you had obviously Kevin Hart, I believe. I'm not sure if The Rock was a part of that or not. I think so, but you've got a lot of big name celebrity investors, but then you've also got various investment funds pouring money into an idea they think will eventually become profitable. This is super common in the business world. Technically, this is what Endeavor is doing right now. The guys that own the UFC, they recently tried to go public, as I've mentioned on here before. There was that old fiasco before COVID hit. Now they're kind of in financial straits, but if you look at Lyft, Uber, some of these giant big name places that you see, WeWork was another huge one, right? Tesla for the longest time. People pump money in, investors pump money in now, so they get enough shares and they get enough, money set aside that if PFL ends up becoming this giant profitable machine, similar to what the UFC did, they have a bunch of shares and they get a bunch of money and growth out of it. That's what investment is all about. And in this case, the PFL is still going around trying to get more people to invest in them so that they can continue on and eventually turn that corner where they become profitable. Will that happen? Only time will tell. But they are in that startup growth phase where they are going around getting seed money, getting investment money. Sorry, they're beyond seed money at this point. Obviously, they've had a couple of years under their belt, but they're getting investment money and needing to pitch and get people to give them more investment money, because without it, they would have to shut their doors. They are not profitable based on their operations right now, and especially with some of the signings. Anthony Pettis, big signing for them. Rory McDonald, huge signing for them. Sounds like Pettis was talking about going to welterweight first, so you could see that matchup in the PFL, which would be massive. But in terms of turning a profit, they're nowhere near that yet. So you need to get continuing money flowing in from investors, and going on a place like Bloomberg television is a great way to do that. In the financial world, in terms of getting news, you've got the Wall Street Journal and you've got Bloomberg. Those are the big players, right? You've got others as well, but those are two massive players in the market. I would argue that they're the two biggest players in the market. I could see arguments against that, but for my money, Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal are really these huge news and financial news outlets. So going on to Bloomberg television and having graphics that state that PFL is the number 2 MMA organization. Yes, they did show that on Bloomberg television. Yes, number 2 mixed martial arts organization in the world. They're going on that. They're saying these things. They're touting their numbers, all of that, so that they can get investment money, so that they hope that someone who works for an investment firm or a wealthy investor who's looking at diversifying their portfolio sees that interview and says, oh, wow, okay, yeah, MMA's hot. Yes, yeah, I heard about the UFC being 4 billion, and now look, this is number 2, and they've got these growth rates, and they've got all this cool technology. All right, I'm going to look into this. Maybe I'll go ahead and invest some money. That's all it is. It's marketing themselves to investment firms, to individual investors, angel investors, people of that nature, in order to get money and to keep their operations flowing. And it's a very smart move on their part. Rather than go to, some of the other MMA media sites that we know, right? Mainstream, you could go to ESPN, you could go to MMA fighting, some of these bigger outlets, you go to the Body Lock, right? Just saying, you know, rather than go to those outlets and really push hard on the marketing there, they're going to places where they can pick up investors and sponsors. That's another thing, right? Might not be that, hey, we're going to invest a bunch of money in the PFL right now, but we do want a sponsorship with you where, we'll go ahead and give you our logos. We'll go ahead, throw you some money as long as you show our logos on your fighters' trunks or on the ring, that's or in the cage. That's how business is done. Another key part of this is that they are touting, I believe his name is Don. Yes, they are touting on these graphics that they're showing on Bloomberg Television. They're touting Don Davis as founder and chairman of the PFL. There's no mention of Ray Sefo at all when they're doing this. That's important. Obviously, you had World Series of Fighting, which was PFL's predecessor, and they're really trying to that tells me they're really trying to distance themselves from World Series of Fighting. World Series of Fighting had some issues, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in the background. Michael Fidel, who wrote for us, broke that piece about Ali Abdelaziz's involvement with World Series of Fighting and the PFL and his connection to Ray Sefo, all of that. They are putting forward Don Davis as the founder and chairman and really trying to distance themselves from what World Series of Fighting was. They're trying to say this is a brand new league. This is a brand new thing, trying to kind of sweep under the rug that, it's also got a lot of the inner workings of World Series of Fighting. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. From a business perspective, that's a really good move, right? You had a venture in World Series of Fighting that didn't turn out the way you wanted to. You had a couple of media reports and things that didn't paint them in the best of light by the time they kind of wound down. It makes sense to distance and rebrand. Lots of companies do this. This is not a knock on the PFL for doing that. That's what you should do as a brand. And look how far it's taken them. Well, I don't think World Series of Fighting would have been able to sign Anthony Pettis. I don't think that you'd be looking at, the same type of hype around World Series of Fighting, even if they, did a rebrand of World Series of Fighting. It was like, oh, yeah, we're back doing all this stuff. No, they really have taken a unique idea and taken what was World Series of Fighting and now transformed it into a organization that is being talked about in the same breath as One Championship and Bellator and the UFC to an extent, right? That is saying a lot. That's a really good rebrand and pivot in business. So kudos to PFL for doing that. But if you see PFL on Bloomberg or you see these graphics of like number 2 organization in the world and what's going on and all this stuff, it's all about marketing to investors. And they're going to be heavy on viewership numbers and things where you may scratch your head and say, why are they talking about potential viewers? Why are they talking about, all this other stuff? It's because they're trying to get people to invest in. It's the same thing the One Championship has done and is doing in terms of saying, well, look at all of our social media metrics and look at all of our, growth that we've had. Now we're in all these different markets and all of our YouTube views, all this stuff. It's all about pitching to investors and saying, look, we are on the rise. Invest with us now. Give us $5 million now, and you'll get $500 million in the next 10 years. That's the type of startup pitch that they are going to right now. And going through a place like Bloomberg is a great way to do it. So that's why PFL is on Bloomberg. That's why if you see those graphics, if you're scratching your head saying, it's a pitch deck for potential investors. That's all this is. All right, guys. Well, that wraps up the first episode of the Fight Business Podcast for 2021. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe if you haven't done it already. If you have, really appreciate it again. Drop any comments. I want to know your thoughts about, is middleweight really stacked, or is it as I perceive it to be a push for Israel Adesanya? What you're looking forward to maybe learning from the unsealed UFC antitrust documents, how you would feel about the Ali Act in MMA. That's a big one. I know people have strong opinions about it. Let me know how you feel. And again, if you want to talk anything that I've covered or anything about the business of MMA, hit me up in the comment section or at Twitter on all day Auger. That's ALLDAYAUGER. And again, I got a new setup going. I'm hoping to do some big things this year with the podcast. Really appreciate the listener and the growth that we've had with this show last year. It means the world to me. So I can't thank you enough. If you're a first time watcher, listener, thank you so much. And again, a huge shout out to anybody listening on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you. Always appreciate that as well. Hope to grow this thing and get some really good guests this year. I've got a couple of things planned that aren't quite solidified yet, so I don't want to jinx it just yet, but I'm hoping that we get some really good guests on that you guys enjoy. So thanks so much. And as always, get money.